Hi, everyone. Today it is my pleasure to interview Gv Freeman about self-care for founders and its importance in building effective teams and preventing burnout. Gv is a coach for tech startup founders. He is internationally recognized speaker. He's an author. He also helps founders launch tech startups in a mindful way. Welcome to the show, Gv.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So how did you get started working with SaaS founders?
My history is super varied. I could tell you that in the early 2000s, I was a DJ on a cruise ship, and then I finally decided to grow up. But I will tell you, there's something interesting about that, and I don't want to go too far off topic, but being a DJ, I was a DJ for almost 15 years. And I would say that gave me a lot of experience being in front of people and learning how to read a room and learning what people were really kind of appealing to, and how to tell if your message was resonating, or in that case, your music was resonating. So I got a lot of extra marketing skills from my DJ days. But when I really started was probably 2003. I started a digital agency in a small town in the middle of central Nebraska before digital agencies really even existed. And by 2006 and 2007, we were building web-based, database-driven applications. SaaS wasn't even a thing. We didn't even have the idea of monthly reoccurring revenue and ARR and churn rate. None of that stuff was there. We were just doing what the technology allowed. And then really over the last 10 years, I have spent working in consulting and helping founders and companies launch their startups and kind of package and market them for go-to-market.
Got it. And when did your journey as far as the self-care started?
That is another long story, but the short version is I bought a Groupon. I was going to run a marathon in 2012, and I said I could use a little more flexibility, so I bought a Groupon for a yoga class. I think I bought 15 yoga classes for $30, and I had never been to a yoga class before, and I walked in, and within a year, I had done my yoga teacher training, and that was in 2013. Since then, I teach some yoga on the side. I do a lot of mindfulness work. I also follow sort of a shamanic path, and I found myself in Peru doing sacred medicine work as well. So I call myself a spiritual tourist, and I'm really open to all modalities that help people kind of find their true passion, their true dharma in life, and hopefully figure out how that makes happiness, really.
And I think this is a topic that is definitely underserved, and people do not talk enough about self-care, and especially in the SaaS world where the founders, the majority of them are software engineers, and this is just not cool to talk about this, right? Software engineers are really analytical, they're like guys, but at some point they really feel that there's a need for them to talk about this. And when they start talking about this with other founders, they're surprised to hear that other founders are going through the same. So where do we start in identifying that, yes, there is a problem that we need to start diagnosing?
Where do we start? We start with the industry. We start with 15 years, probably 10 to 15 years of baggage. And we start with people that have been telling founders to work 18-hour days nonstop, to have a side hustle for their side hustle. My hashtag, the hashtag that I love using the most, is stop crushing it. Because in reality, I believe that founders have to work hard. And I believe that it's going to take a lot of time and effort to change the world, but we do not have to do it at our own emotional health and the risk of that. So I think that it's starting to happen now. You have VC firms that are devoting a portion of their investment dollars to self-care and therapy for their founders and founding teams. You do have incubators and accelerators that are saying, man, teaching people how to take care of themselves is really important. But we have a fundamental problem, I would say, in our industry that says this isn't important, especially in the beginning. If it's your first time around, you don't really care about self-care because you haven't gotten into a struggle yet. And the problem with a lot of that is that it sneaks up on you. You don't really know it's happening until you have gotten to a point where you can't get out of bed in the morning, or you show up and you're always blowing up at your founder or your co-founders or your teams, or your marriage is falling apart because you don't have a safe and healthy outlet for your emotions and all of the stress that's happening at work. So a lot of people don't know what's happening until it's too late. And much like therapy was 10 years ago, people didn't want to talk about therapy 10 or 20 years ago. They thought that it was a taboo topic. And I absolutely am not in that camp. I think that every founder should have a therapist or a coach or somebody to really hold witness for them. So that was a whole bunch of stuff. I'll let you pick one of those places and see where we want to go from there.
First of all, at what stage majority of founders come to you?
I find I typically work with two types of founders. They're starting at zero or they're broken. And most of the time, the broken ones are making $1 million or more, oftentimes $2 to $5 million. And there's things that are really broken about the company or the culture or about their life. They've built this amazing thing and they've been working really hard on building it. And once they've built it, they're still not happy. And they turn around and they look at the last 1 to 3 to 5 to 10 years of their life. And they say, wow, I built this thing and I got everything that I asked for, but I'm still not happy. So that's one. That's the broken kind. The people that are starting at zero, they usually have an idea. They don't have a product yet in the market, and they're just trying to build their first thing. And it's confusing, and there's no great roadmap, or in the past, there was not a great roadmap. So when we're talking about self-care, it's the first group of founders that need to know the most about it and to really lift up the lid on self-care. The second group, the brand new guys, the people, guys and gals, the folks that are just launching, they have so much energy and things haven't gotten really shitty yet. So that's, they will experience it at some point.
So the second type, the broken type, when you start working with them and untangle all kind of problems, what is the biggest or the single most often missed area that you see?
So I would say from the self-care perspective, most of the founders that I work with have never been taught how to experience their feelings or to separate their feelings from their actions. So as an example of this, one of the greatest examples that I use is anger is a perfectly healthy emotion to have. Acting out on that anger is oftentimes not healthy. So I have sat in a room of the founder that I was working with at this time had been 22 years, had founded his company and called me in, and he called me not for self-care reasons. He called me because the company was not growing and they were sort of broken. And we were sitting in a room one day and I made a comment and he got so angry at me that not only did he yell at me, but he slammed his fist on the table and he made the entire room shrink. And that's a perfect example. And that's an example that I see a lot, is that people have this angry feeling, but they think that the right way to handle that is by expressing their anger in physical ways. And that's usually what I see most often, is people are having feelings, whether that's happy, sad, angry. They're having those feelings, but they're coming out in ways that are really unhealthy. So does that help?
Yep, and that's from the self-care from emotional perspective. How about the business perspective?
Yeah, so from the business perspective, what I specifically deal with is misalignment. And the misalignment actually does move into the self-care piece as well. A lot of people try and build something because they think that they want that thing that they're going to build is going to make them happy. But in reality, they build it and they're not happy. And that is just misalignment. But I would tell you the biggest business problems that I find for especially new SaaS founders is a misalignment between product, marketing, and sales. The product does one thing. It's been built a certain way. Marketing sells it in a different way. And then sales sells it in a different way. And by the time it actually gets to the customer doesn't get what they thought they were going to get. And it's all caused by an enormous amount of misalignment across all three of those, in theory, departments. Depending on the size of your company, you may not have 3 separate departments, but if you do have 3 separate people running those 3 departments, it's a high chance that there is a lot of misalignment across the 3 because they don't know how to speak each other's languages. You kind of need a product to marketing translator and a marketing to sales translator, and then somebody to connect the dots.
So result of not being happy with where you are is a symptom of the disease misalignment, right? The condition misalignment. How can we take a step back and think about this, thinking about a few years ago, what majority of founders could have done a few years ago to make sure that this disease does not creep on us?
Yeah, there's no great answer here. Like if I was to give you the Buddhist or the Hindu cause of suffering, it is ignorance. So it's lack of knowledge. That's what causes our suffering. It is fundamentally as simple as that, but in that simplicity, it's incredibly complicated. And I would also say this, that what we think is going to make us happy in our teens and 20s doesn't make us happy in our 30s and 40s, and doesn't make us happy in our 50s and 60s. As we grow older, the things that make us happy change. So if we start a startup when we're 19, 20, 21 years old, if we didn't strike it rich and hit the nail on the head from the beginning, there's a good chance that 5 to 10 years from now, we're not going to be happy with that, because we're a different person. We're always evolving as humans. So the way that I tell people, the way that I help people figure out kind of what is contentment and what is happiness is another kind of loaded word of mindfulness. You hear a lot about mindfulness today, but another way to think of mindfulness is just non-judgmental awareness. I have to begin to slow my life down a little bit. I have to be willing to look at what I'm doing and how that's making me feel. And every time what I'm doing and how I'm making me feel become misaligned, then I get to begin examining those things. We look at thoughts and feelings, and all of those thoughts and feelings create our reality. So slowing down and being very mindful or very aware of how we're feeling all through the journey, whether you're a brand new founder or whether you've been doing it for 10 or 20 years, slowing down and realizing how I'm feeling about my day-to-day work is the first step in finding some peace and happiness.
And so for us to take time and start thinking about this is probably pretty tough, right? Especially for founders who work 10, 15 hours a day. It sounds like it needs to be something more systematic versus you do it once a month for 2 hours. It needs to be more systematic. Do you have any recommendation on an ongoing basis, your recommendations for founders to make sure that we take time and think about all of those things?
Yes, and you're hitting it 100% on the head, that I can't do this once a month. And the common Western tradition today is I work my ass off for 50 weeks out of the year, and then I decide to go on a big vacation. So I go on this big vacation, and I think that I'm going to de-stress from my vacation. Well, de-stressing ends up like jumping out of airplanes and scuba diving and drinking a lot of alcohol, or like the Western way of de-stressing actually is putting more stress and more harm on the body. But that's the way that we typically think about it. I'm going to take a vacation. I'm going to go get crazy and blow off some steam. But what we're really doing is just hurting our body more. And the way that I work with founders today is I just use a simple 80-20 rule. So 80% of the time you are working on your business, and 20% of the time you are working on self-care. And that would mean that for every 8 hours in an 8-hour workday, I got to find a couple of hours to do self-care. Now, I'm not saying that self-care equals sitting down and meditating for 2 hours. I'll even go a step back and kind of talk a little bit about what the journey looks like for somebody new on the self-care path. So a lot of times people will start in the physical body. So I kind of categorize things in 4 bodies. The first is the physical body. And what I usually do is I go to the gym. I go to the gym and I start eating healthy. Those are the first ways that I begin to incorporate self-care into my life. And a lot of people are doing that already. Some people can take those things and they can actually turn them into kind of harming effects. So I can be in the gym 2 to 3 hours a day and I can actually harm my body, or I can go down a different path. But gym and food, first good steps in physical. Then let's say you're at the gym, you're running on the treadmill. and somebody tells you, hey, you should really listen to this Brene Brown podcast. You might actually enjoy it. And they'll say, well, I've never heard of her. And somebody will say, well, it might actually help you be a little happier. So then they listen to this Brene Brown podcast, or they listen to a book on how to be happy. That I call the mental body. So we have now moved from the physical body into the mental body. And it's me studying, it's me learning, it's me challenging my own self and my own perspective of the world. Now I read this Brene Brown book, and she's talking about feelings and vulnerability and really weird things that I've never talked about before. And now that I know some of those things, now I need to figure out what to do with them. And now when I start to work on those things, I move into the emotional body. The emotional body usually requires the help, especially in the beginning, usually requires the help of somebody else. That might be a therapist, that might be a coach, that might be a mentor, somebody who can start working through some of that stuff with you. From the emotional body, then we sort of move into the spiritual body, and that is really finding our purpose in life. It doesn't even have to be woo. We don't even have to talk about things like God or a power greater than ourselves. It's really about what makes us happy and content and who we are as a human being. And doing that inner study is what I would call the spiritual path. So that's really the path that we go through. And I lump all of that into self-care. So you can go to the gym for an hour, you can eat a healthy meal for 30 minutes, and you can meditate for 30 minutes. That's your 2 hours of self-care. You could do all of that in an 8-hour workday. Now, if you work longer than 8 hours, then you're going to have to build in a little more self-care. I would encourage you to get a therapist. I encourage you to grab a coach, have somebody helping you work through some of that stuff. But the 80-20 rule is a perfect ratio to help you get started in your journey.
Can you give us some examples and practical recommendations? How can we start identifying those problems? What questions do we need to ask ourselves to get us to think about, am I really happy? Am I really moving where I want to be? Is this how I envision things going to be in 2 years?
We're not trained to associate with happy nearly as much as we are to associate with unhappy or sad. So if you imagine when you're 3 years old, our parents start to say no to us about 80% of the time. So mom says, stop touching that. Dad says, go pick that up. Don't do that again. Like we get the negative talk that starts when we are kids is the predominant line that we hear. 80% of our thoughts, by the time we reach adulthood, 80% of our thoughts are negative. 90% of those thoughts are repetitive. So not only am I thinking negative thoughts, but I'm thinking them again and again and again and again. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about that in a second, but those negative thoughts are what we latch on to. And the way that those negative thoughts manifest themselves into our lives, like I'll give you some examples. There's a study done, which I'm happy to provide a link to, but founders are 2 times more likely to have a mental health condition. We are 2 times more likely to suffer from depression. We are 6 times more likely to suffer from ADHD. We are 3 times more likely to suffer from substance abuse. And one of the worst, we are 10 times more likely to develop bipolar conditions, double the amount of psychiatric hospitalization. We are double the amount to have suicidal thoughts. That's hard data that is telling us as founders that we are not taking care of ourselves very well. So if you have already been to the doctor potentially, or if you're already seeing a therapist, or you're somebody close to you is already saying, hey, you might want to get this looked at. Those are potential signs manifesting in the body that I might be having a problem. That's usually where we start out. We look at the negative first, because wherever we put our energy, that is going to grow. So if I'm looking at the negative thoughts, if I'm looking at the negative, then the negative is going to grow in my life, and then I'm going to have to start doing something about it. When you see that start to happen, that's when people come and work with folks like you and I. They come and they say, I need help. I am not happy. And that's when we get to start realizing that there is a problem, and we get to start changing the framework about how we think about things. Does that help?
It does. I'd like for you to kind of keep talking about this. I want you to keep kind of untangling this topic?
Yeah. So the next place that I was going to go is if 80% of our thoughts are negative and 95% of them are repetitive, then what we need to start doing is untangling those thoughts. So there is a model that I actually work with founders on where we really start at the thought level. So let's imagine something. You go to work one morning and you get an email and you had been working on this deal for 6 months. You've been working on this big $100,000 enterprise deal. And this was what was going to make payroll for like the next 3 months. And you get in this case, COVID happens and you just lost this deal. Let's call that a circumstance. So something happened in your life, and as a result of that, you begin to have thoughts. Now, let me ask you, if this happened to you, would you think positive thoughts or negative thoughts?
I think not a lot of people would think positive thoughts.
Okay. So that thought now I have a negative thought. Now that negative thought could be, how am I going to make payroll? How am I going to keep my company going? What am I going to do next? And then we add on top of that, thoughts stack on top of each other, and we begin to catastrophize. Like, we can go from 0 to shitty in literally 30 seconds from one single email. Now, this is before we have thought about it. We've talked to our co-founder. Maybe we should call the customer and say, hey, what's going on? Let's talk about this. Maybe there's another implementation strategy. Maybe we can spread out the payments. There's a lot of ways that we could reapproach this deal. But what happens is we have one negative thought that turns into another negative thought that turns into another negative thought. And you know what happens? Those thoughts create feelings. So now this thought inside of me creates some level of panic in this case. Or as a real feeling, it's fear. It's fear underneath, fear of uncertainty, lots of different fear. So that fear then releases hormones into my body. And here's where we're actually getting into the physiological effects of what a single thought can do. I can have a negative thought that can make me feel scared. That scared feeling now releases adrenaline and cortisol into my body, natural hormones that release into my body. And when those hormones release into my body, I begin to become a much worse decision maker. I don't get to have all of the creative flexibility that I am used to having when all of those hormones are racing through my body. And now every additional thought that I add in adds more of those really negative hormones. When those hormones get released in my body, then I begin to do a few things. I begin to act, react, enact, in other words, not do something. You may have heard of it, fight, flight, or freeze. That's what ends up happening, all from the single thought that I have. I begin to fight, flight, or freeze based on that one thought, and my actions create my reality. So we are having thousands, 60,000 or more thoughts per day. And if 60,000 of those thoughts are negative and 95% of them are repetitive, and I just continue adding on, do you think that those negative thoughts have the ability to change my reality? I can have a good day or a bad day all based on my thought pattern. So what we have to do as coaches, as founders, as witnesses, as shamans, however you want to call yourself, as mentors, as coaches, whoever it is, we have to start at the thought process. And we have to start looking at what each one of those thoughts are and knowing that thoughts by themselves are not good and bad.
But in this situation, how can we really think about something positive?
I think there's a lot of ways that we can, again, if I want to take that situation and turn it into a potential positive, I become a problem solver rather than a reactor. And the problem solving aspect is what we don't do very well. So self-care, I like to say that as self-care strategists, we become preventionalists. We don't become interventionalists. So if we're working on self-care, we're preventing these negative thoughts. But if the negative thoughts are already in there, now we have to intervene. And this works the same way for employees. If we have employees that are also having challenges at work, if we're managing a team of developers and those developers are constantly having struggles, my guess is that there is opportunities for growth among that team as well. If we become emotionally intelligent, we can solve an enormous number of problems. We can have coaching conversations with our employees that are much more effective if they and I are more emotionally healthy. And that comes from self-care.
I love it. So the solution to the problem is to not think and dwell in this negative thoughts and just start thinking what it is that you can do about, and that changes your mindset and changes your thought pattern, and hopefully going to prevent you from all of those negative effects that negative thoughts can have on the body.
And again, I'll challenge you and say we only assign negative and positive. Our thoughts by themselves are not negative and positive. They are just thoughts. We get to choose whether or not we want to pay attention to them. We get to choose whether or not we want to make them negative and positive. I can choose not to believe the thought that I'm having. And that goes right back to mindfulness. That goes back to non-judgmental awareness. I don't have to judge the thought that I'm having. All I have to do is recognize that I'm having the thought. Adding that, so this is what I say meditation is for people. At least it is for me. I don't know what it is for everybody else. Meditation as a practical application for me. Imagine I am a giant bomb and I have a 1-foot fuse coming out of one of my ears. When that thought happens, when I get that email in the morning that the customer canceled their contract or didn't want to go on the sale, I literally grab a lighter and I light this fuse coming out of my ear, and it starts a slow 1-foot burn. Now, if I have meditated that morning, if I have been involved in my self-care practice, that 1-foot fuse becomes a 2-foot fuse. And when I have a 2-foot fuse, now I get a chance, I get just a little bit of extra time to say, man, what is going on here? That really makes me angry, or that really makes me sad. And I get to ask myself the question. I get to call my coach. I get to call a therapist. I get to call my co-founder and say, man, I don't know what to do right now. This is freaking me out. That phrase, this is freaking me out, all that is non-judgmental awareness. All it is me saying, I have a thought and I don't really want to believe this thought anymore.
Let's make it a little bit more practical. We have a few minutes left. And for a founder who is not happy, for a founder who doesn't know what to do, we work 15 hours a day, we still have family that we need to take care of, everyone's so stressed out. What's the way out? Well,
if they're working 15 to 20 hours a day on a regular basis, there is no healthy, sustainable path to self-care in that. And unfortunately, I just can't give you a great self-care methodology that includes working consecutive 15-hour days for long months at a time. If that is your path, then it's going to be really challenging to take care of yourself. That's just one of the hard facts of what we're dealing with. But to get really practical, here's what I would say. I give founders 3 different types of tools. I talk a lot about, I use the framework operational, tactical, and strategic. So operational is somebody sitting there writing code. Tactical is my developers and my product owner working together to come up with the new feature that we're going to build. And strategic is my product owner, my engineering team, and my CEO working together to come up with this company strategy. So that's the idea of strategic, tactical, and operational. And I do the same thing with self-care. When you have a thought, when you have a really challenging situation in the middle of your day, I encourage you to use the acronym STOP. And the S stands for stop what you're doing. Pause. Just take a moment. The T stands for take a few deep breaths. The O stands for observe your body and smile. Now, the smiling piece is super important. People think that it's a joke, but I will tell you that if you can smile in a challenging situation, your entire mood, your body will change if you can encourage yourself to smile. It's the reason why they say telemarketers should smile on the phone, because our tone of voice changes, our body changes when we get a smile. And then the last one is P, which is proceed with kindness and compassion to yourself and others as best as you can. So that is the operational tip that I could give. That's what you're doing when you're in the moment. The next one is kind of the daily practice. If you have the chance, I tell people to incorporate the 5 S's into their daily practice. So the first one is soothe, and that might be meditation, that could be yoga, it could be quiet time reading a book. The next one is sun. try and get some vitamin D. Try and get outside. If you're in a place that has enough sun, go out and get some sun. The next one is sweat. Try and break a sweat. We have those hormones in our body, adrenaline and cortisol. They leave the body through sweating. Get good sleep. And then finally, find a way to serve. Be a volunteer of some kind. Get out of your own head and give back. I've been a big brother with Big Brothers Big Sisters for close to 9 years now. And that volunteering, when I am helping somebody else, I then forget about myself. So that's what I try and do on a daily basis or relatively frequently. And then the last thing at the strategic level, I'm just going to tell you to do this. Focus on your sleep, reduce your stress, get sugar out of your body, and develop a routine. That is a moment-to-moment, a daily, and a kind of ongoing goal, strategic practice that you can use for your life if you need help. And also, if people have questions, I give a whole bunch of tips. I have a self-care toolkit that if people are interested in, they can go to gvfreeman.com. It's right on the homepage. It's about halfway down the homepage. There's a button to download the self-care toolkit. All of that stuff that I just talked about is in there.
Are there any other questions that I didn't ask you but I should have?
I'm going to go back to something that you touched on a little earlier, but how do we change the industry? As founders today, I want to work with founders who are interested in this kind of these topics and making a better community, because I think that if we can take a company that's 1 and 2 people and we can build a culture of self-care and acceptance and emotional intelligence into that small little company, then when the company grows and we have more people, they will also have self-care, the permission to take care of themselves built into their life. So I just want to say, like, let's take a moment and see and take a temperature of the health of our companies and how we are treating ourselves, because the way that we're treating ourselves is often the way that we treat others. So the company, the industry that we are in today, like, stop using the phrase crush it. Like, stop using those really harsh phrases that are encouraging people to do harm to themselves and others, whether they know it or not. I would just ask that we take a moment and care about other people slightly more than we care about the revenue that we're generating right now.
Are there any books that that were really impactful and you would recommend to founders?
Yeah, I would say, I mentioned Brene Brown earlier, and this is an audio program. It's actually not a book. She had written a couple of books first, and then she came out with a program that you can get on Audible or Amazon, and it's called The Power of Vulnerability. And it's about 6.5 hours. That program alone has changed my life. I listen to it a couple of times a year. I would say the next one, which is a really short book, but has kind of woken me up to a lot of really interesting, very simple facts, is called The 4 Agreements. It's by Don Miguel Ruiz. You know, from a meditation, mindfulness perspective, if that is really interesting to you, I would say read a book called The Untethered Soul by Michael Singer. And then the last one, which is just a really fun read, Elizabeth Gilbert wrote a book called Big Magic, and it's about creativity. And the amazing thing about all of the stuff that we're talking about right now, there are 5 areas of focus. I'll kind of maybe just end with this. The 5 areas of focus that happen when we bring emotional integrity and emotional intelligence into our personal life and our work life. Our capacity to be, our attentional capacity, the ability for our attention to be very focused and broad, increases when we begin to have emotional intelligence. Another thing that increases is our ability to make better decisions. So when we don't have those chemicals running through our body, we have a much better way of making decisions. Our relationships improve. Like, we build better relationships with our family and our friends and our coworkers and our staff. We have better physical and mental health. And then finally, performance and creativity dramatically increase when employees feel safe in their workplace. If we are a boss, or if we're a founder and we are not emotionally healthy ourselves, and we're potentially shaming or guilting our employees into doing things, then they become less creative. They don't want to say creative thoughts. They don't want to express those things because they might be shamed for having a negative thought or for a bad idea. So all of those things, those 5 things, are direct results of having some emotional intelligence. And the more emotionally intelligent you are, I guarantee you, the more money you will make now or in the future whether that's in this startup or managing larger teams down the road.
I love it. This has been a very loaded episode, and I encourage founders, let it be your 40 minutes of mindfulness listening to this episode for today. Now take another 40 minutes or so and just think about where you are. Are you happy or not? And just think about the potential plan that you can start implementing this week, today, to get on the right path of mindfulness and being happy.
And I would say that even these 40 minutes were probably not very mindful. It was a lot of information, and it could be challenging to comprehend and interpret and integrate into your life. But if it starts you down the path, if you have questions, reach out to me. I love talking to founders every day. I'm happy to spend 20 minutes with almost anyone. So if that's the case, you can reach out to me, gv@gvfreeman.com, or check out the website, gvfreeman.com. I'd love to chat with you.
I love it. Thanks so much, Gv.
Yeah, thank you.